are going to be in Matthew chapter 6, verse 9. We began this new series last Sunday called the Lord's Prayer. If you remember, I challenged you to, as we move forward with this, to seeking for a fresh perspective. Number one, you're looking to potentially see some things that maybe you've never seen before. Maybe you have, but go with an open mind, because this is a section of Scripture that is oftentimes preached or taught on, and it's taught on specifically from our perspective. That is your perspective, my perspective, after the fact. Putting all of the things together that we know about Jesus and all the things that we think we know about the gospel and all the things that we think we believe the church did, the rest of the New Testament. But the reality is we oftentimes have a lens, or we always have a lens through which we hear things and we interpret things, which is why I can say something and there could be 50 different takeaways, okay? So, and that's okay, that's fine. You hear what you hear based on where you are on your journey. My sermon is good to you whether or not you needed to hear it. So that has more to do with you than it has to do with me. Nevertheless, the reality is there is a perspective of the Lord's Prayer that I think is oftentimes missed. And that perspective would have been from a Jewish perspective. We oftentimes read this prayer and we kind of fill in the gaps with the things that we already know, things that they would not have known, perspectives we have, perspectives they would not have had. And so my goal here is to do what I believe Jesus does with this prayer. He uses specific words that reaches back through their DNA, into their ancestry and in their history, their lineage and their tradition. And he basically pulls that out and he unfolds it on the table. And so certain words would have been loaded, volatile, would have been electrical, would have reminded them of a purpose, would have taken them all the way back to when they were freed from oppression in Egypt, and then the covenant that they had with God and what God gave them to help them do the thing that they had partnered with God to do. And so my goal here is to help lay that out for us as best as possible. I'll be honest with you, the reality is I wish, where's Richard Knox? I need a whiteboard that is the length of this stage. Because there is a lot to this. And I hate the fact that I have to break it down the way that I have to break it down, but you're not going to want to sit here for 2 hours as I explain all of this, because that's what it would take. We probably have more people in the foyer than we would have in here. So we don't want to do that. But I promise each week as we unfold the text, we'll reach back and bring it together. And hopefully as the weeks progress, your understanding of what I am trying to say, at least, regardless if you believe it or not, but what I am trying to say will be made clearer to you as we move forward. Now, the Lord's Prayer in Luke chapter 11. The disciples asked Jesus to teach them to pray. So let's reach back to last week and kind of bring to head the foundation, the setup that we created. They asked Jesus to teach them to pray. Why would they ask Jesus to teach them to pray? Because he's their rabbi. They were good Jewish boys. They were raised in understanding Jewish prayers. They knew how to pray. So obviously they didn't miss out on that aspect. But it was a common thing to ask your rabbi, if you were a student, to teach you to pray. Because in that prayer, what the rabbi would do is he would lay out some phrases that would help you better understand and contemplate on his perspective. See things through the lens that he had, that he saw the world. Interpret the Torah the way that he interpreted the Torah. In doing so, he would essentially give you what he believed was the purpose and the most important thing, the thing that you needed to focus on as his student and potentially as a rabbi as well. And so when ask him to teach us to pray, it is a loaded question. And essentially what they're asking is, give us your perspective. So in other words, if, say, one of the teens came to me and said, hey, teach me to pray, what I would do is I would think about, what do I believe is the most important thing in life? What do I believe is the thing that they need to focus on, the thing through the lens through which they need to interpret Scripture, the purpose, what's really behind all of this? And so I would lay out a prayer. It would be a loaded prayer. It wouldn't give them all the details. It's not meant to do that. It's meant to help them contemplate and think about these things deeper. What's below the surface? What's beyond the phrases? And what it would do is reach back into, for them, to things that they were taught, how they were raised, how they grew up, their tradition. And simply put, as a rabbi, you would understand where they came from, which is why you chose specific ones, okay? So there's the picture. The disciples asked Jesus to pray. They're asking for his perspective. And in fact, one of the things they're asking for is, what is your yoke? Which is why Jesus would go from Matthew 11 and say, take my yoke upon you. The yoke was a phrase that, again, reached back into their tradition, reached back into their history, reached back into their understanding of their purpose and their calling in life, their relationship with God. It reached back to the law. It reached back to the covenant. It reached back to their purpose, what their responsibility was. And so when you would ask a rabbi, what is your yoke? What you're asking for is how that rabbi interpreted the Torah. How that rabbi saw what the responsibility was and what they should focus on and the role that they played in bringing about this order of things, whatever it was that they believed that God had called them to do. And so the concept of yoke that we talked about last week is something that you need to remember. It's something that you need to keep in your mind. The term yoke was typically when we talk about yoke, we think what? Servitude. We think maybe oppression a little bit. We think of burden, right? Because we think of an ox, and we think of oxes being yoked to one another, et cetera, et cetera. But actually what the yoke did is connected the ox with the person who was driving the team. And so the yoke of God, as it were, the yoke of the rabbi would be the thing that connected the student, the child, the person, to the being, to the rabbi, to God. And so this word yoke is a loaded word as well. Literally, we think of servitude, we think of law, and we think of obligation. And the Jew would have made that connection as well, because that connection would have been made to the Torah. The Torah explained to them their responsibilities, how they go about bringing about justice and peace, shalom. Oftentimes these phrases, this concept wrapped up in this idea of righteousness. And that's what they would receive from the Torah. But the yoke, the concept of the yoke, also had to do with something being joined together with another. Partners. They would have thought of covenant, the thing that connected them with God. And with a covenant came responsibilities, and they understood that they themselves had a responsibility, something that they themselves needed to fulfill as a nation, as a people. But here's the interesting thing, and this is what I love, because the term yoke literally means the beam between the balances. The beam between the balances would have directly connected them to this concept of justice. What's right? What's balanced? And the order through the Torah, through the will of God, them bringing about this ordering of things, doing life, conducting themselves in such a way that there would be balance, justice, and peace. Again, the term shalom would have oftentimes been used. Now, these ideas, again, directly connected them to their relationship with God and this covenant, and how the Jews basically saw themselves and the role that they were playing in the grand scheme of things. See, the Jews saw themselves as the household of God, specifically chosen by God for a specific reason, for responsibility. They had a covenant with God. They were yoked with God. They were connected with God to bring about this reordering of things. They themselves were going to be a nation that would represent something to other nations. It wasn't just about Israel. It was about the world. And ultimately, it would culminate in the coming of the Messiah. And what the Messiah would do, he would rule the Jews, and he would also rule the world. And Israel would rise to its prominent place and its rightful place among the nations and among the people. And there would be true justice and true peace in the world. And they saw themselves as having a responsibility to help bring this about. All that is wrapped up in the mind of a Jew who asks his rabbi, hey, you teach me to pray? And so, I love this. Jesus says, oh man, this is loaded. Jesus says, okay, pray like this. Our Father, or literally, Father of us in heaven, your name is holy. Stop right there. The very term, our Father, is loaded. Jesus does a couple of things here, and there's no way for me to unfold all of this. Okay, I'm trying to keeping with maybe what the Jews would have understood with these words. When Jesus spoke these words, what was he unfolding and laying on the table for them? Now, understanding that their understanding of what that was and what they thought when Jesus said this would have evolved as they saw things unfold with the life of Jesus, as they began to get a clear image and understanding of what God was doing and their role and what was going on, okay? But let's try our best to understand it from where they were at the time when Jesus says this. And we're just going to do our best, okay? And if we do that, I think that there is at the core of this prayer, no matter how things evolve, at the core, there is this truth. And that's what we want to expose with this. And so when Jesus says, our Father, first of all, obviously he's making this claim, this connection that he has with God. But what he is saying is, and for our purposes, focus on this, that there is something that binds us together. That is, Jesus and his disciples. Remember, they're the ones who asked how to pray. There's something that binds us together. We are connected here. And the thing that we're connected by is the same parent. What? The Jews, it was not common for them to refer to God as Father. I know there's some arguments about, well, you know, in some of the literature and some of the things, and God's referred to, you know, as it's obvious he refers to him as a father. Yeah, but in the same passages and in some of the same contexts, he's referred to as a mother. They didn't typically view God as a father. And in fact, think about God and what you think about God, the mental visualization that you have of God, and take that and put it off the table. Because that's not how the Jews saw God necessarily. And to refer to God as a father, what would they thought? What's the image that they would have? What's the thing that would surface that would probably raise a lot of questions? It's almost impossible for us to really know what they would have been thinking, right? Like, what does this mean? And I believe that their understanding of that would have unfolded later on, especially as they understood Jesus as really being the Messiah and what that really meant. But are there some things that when Jesus says Father, this thing that connects the disciples with Jesus, is there something in their history? Is there something in their understanding? Is there something in their culture and their tradition that Jesus would have tapped into that would have helped them maybe begin to see things in a different light? Oh yeah, very much so. When Jesus says, our Father, if you were a Jew, specific things would surface, and here's what they are. First of all, as I like to do, look at the word Father. Literally the word that's used here means male ancestor, okay? Natural father. But it's also a word that can reference both parents, which is interesting because it's talking about an idea or a concept and not just a physical person or being, okay? The word also had to do with an author, the originator of something, the originator of a family, you might say. It was a title of honor, and it was seen as an honorable thing, okay? At least among a family or a household. But it also meant one who infused his spirit inside the spirit of another, which would do what? Help this person see and think and believe and conduct themselves the way that you would. Think about the relationship between rabbi and student. And then Jesus later on, remember Jesus says, call no man father. Remember that? That's connected with that. Jesus isn't, never mind, we're not going there. Nevertheless, the concept of father, okay, as a Jew, had to do with some specific position, an idea that went beyond biological concepts or emphasis. And so think about a Jew, and you think about their parents. Your identity as a Jew was directly connected to who your parents were, to your household, to your lineage. There was no, hey, I think one day I want to be this. No, it was determined who you were going to be and what you were going to do before you were even born. You were born into it, you were handed it. Being in a household, a family, we're not just talking about the people who live under the same roof, was an industry. It was an industry. And everybody had a role in making sure the industry of that home was successful and that everybody had what they needed. And everybody having what they needed, they had their share. And in doing so, in the home, there will be justice and righteousness. And as a result, what? Peace. And so when you talked about the concept of the father or a mother, what would come to the mind, what would surface, would be a parent. And the parent, the father, was the one who owned the household. He was responsible for the household. He was the author, the originator of the household. When you say parent, when you say father to a Jew in that time, we definitely know that it would have tapped into that idea. We're talking about the person who is the originator, the author, who is responsible, the one who runs the house. And so remembering that the house was an industry. And so let's say we were all family. None of us have a house big enough for us all to live in, right? Some of you have land that we can camp on. But we're all family. And we're all connected by this name, by this bloodline. Some of you have married into it. Some of you are servants in the house. But our industry in this house, let's just say it was, I don't know, selling cars. Let's say it was, selling cars. Your responsibility will be wrapped up in this identity of a car salesman, of a person who provide cars in whatever shape or form. You would either be selling them, be fixing them, be building them, be creating them. You would be cleaning them. You would be filling them. Anything you did, you found a place to help that industry of that home to survive, to succeed, to prosper. That was the concept of a Jewish household. It was an industry. And now you see the need for patron system because you need to know somebody who's going to help you in your house to become better, to become prosperous, to become bigger. And so, just simply saying the word father directly connected to this concept of a household and the one who owns, who originates the household, one who is worthy of respect, one who is looked to, because remember, it didn't matter how old you got, as long as your parents were alive, they had sway over you. And if you were a woman, you might be married, but ultimately, your father, if he's still alive, still had sway over you in some way or another. It's a different world. It's a different culture. It's a different way of seeing things. And so we can at least say when Jesus says our Father, he's not just connecting them two together, it would bring to the surface this idea of a household. Home, lineage, ancestry, history, which is why scriptures and the Jews would often say what? Our forefathers, right? This words or language is always used to connect them back to their lineage and their identity, which was wrapped up in that. There wasn't a whole lot of freedom of choice there. But Jesus says our Father would have talked about this household of things. And now why would Jesus say that? And okay, let's just say that it does bring to mind this idea of the one who runs and owns the house. Well, what's the house? What are we talking about here? What is the house? Well, from a Jewish perspective, especially when Jesus says it reaches back. Now, they might not have been thinking about this, but it does reach back to their ancestry, to their heritage, their tradition, to where God freed them, right, and became their God, as it were. We're talking about coming out of Egypt, the giving of the law, and all those things that ended up happening. From the Jewish perspective, the household of God was the world. From one perspective, it was the world. And Scripture even illustrates this very thing. Leviticus 25:23. The land, he says, must not be sold permanently. We're talking about them coming into the promised land, how they're going to order themselves, the things that they're going to do. And in fact, this chapter is all about making sure that your fellow brother or sister does not fall under oppression because of your hands. Then he says this, the land that you have to your name must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. And you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. What? Yeah, I'm going to give you this land, but guess what? It ain't yours. And you don't do certain things with it. Why? Because it's not yours. It's mine. And you're residing in it as strangers. Now, that's quite a bit different, and it's easy to overlook this concept of Israel and the promised land and the things that they were given and how they were blessed, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the point was still made. Yeah, you're still strangers here. This is my house. You don't own this house. You don't run this house. In fact, the verbiage is also, you see that in Ezekiel chapter 48 and verse 14. You Psalm chapter 24, verse 1. We know this one. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all who live in it, echoed in Psalm 89 again. You also have Psalm 50, verses 9 through 12. I love this one. Look what he says. I love it. He says, I have no need. This is God. I have no need of a bull from your stall or of goats from your pens, for every animal of the forest is mine. And then he says, and the cattle on 1,000 hills, that's mine. And he says, I know every bird in the mountains and the insects in the fields are mine. Here it is. Hey, if I'm hungry, God says, I'm not going to tell you. For the world is mine and all that is in it. So from one perspective, the Jews saw their connection with God, his ownership of the house. And the house here would be the world. But from another perspective, the Jews themselves were considered very special in God's house. And they were referred to as the household of Israel. If you notice in Numbers chapter 12, verse 7, there's this debate. There's this Miriam and Aaron, Moses' brother and sister. It seems like they thought Moses was a little too prideful or, thought himself be special. And they're like, he's not so special. Like, aren't we prophets too? Like, look at us. Look at what we do. And then God says, listen, when it comes to prophets, how do I speak to them? Yeah, in visions and in dreams. But not so with Moses. For he is faithful in all my household. Some might say among all of my people, or in the household of Israel. And so, again, I know that's a lot to say to come back to our Father. But the Our Father would have brought all of this to the surface, and Jesus is reaching back to this, reminding them, if you will, maybe giving them a fresh perspective of this reality, who they were, where they come from, what they are a part of. And so to speak to God as a father to these Jews is to speak of the one who is the author, the one who is the originator, who owns and runs this house. And so it might be said that Jesus says, begin your prayer like this: to the one who runs this house. Then he says, the Father of us, to the one who runs this house, who's in heaven. I pointed up because that's what we think, right? In heaven. Now here's the thing. Jews didn't think of heaven the way we think of heaven, so let's just pull that off the table here. To the Jews, there's lots of different ideas and concepts to this, and so there isn't just one idea that we need to focus on, other than the fact that heaven represented the ideal. Heaven represented the ideal, where God dwells. And where God dwells, things are done in the way that God wants them done. They're done. Where God dwells, there is justice, there is righteousness, right? There is this peace, and yet God has has a covenant, connected himself with mankind to bring about the righteousness, the justice, and peace that is in heaven, that is where he dwells on the earth. And so not only was there this idea on the surface, there's this concept below the surface as well, that they are connected to, and that they have a responsibility to bring that, as it were, here on earth. So we're talking about a place where God dwells, right? Where things are done orderly, if you will. And in thinking about heaven, you're thinking about someplace other than where you are. And if it's the ideal, it stirs up what within a person? Hope. Hope. Because it directly connected to them in their history of this covenant with God and bringing about these things on earth. And so what they would have thought about was this ideal place where we are, things are not the way they're supposed to be. And so the one who runs this house in heaven, we recognize and acknowledge that things are not here the way they should be, where you are, as it were. So our Father in heaven. And then he says, hallowed, some translations say, be your name, or holy is your name. Let's focus on just the name first, your name. Remember, we talk about our identity. One's identity, your reputation, your character, the world's expectations of you and who you were directly connected to your name, your lineage, your household. You didn't determine who you were going to be. There wasn't this freedom of choice that, I think I'm going to be a lawyer when your daddy's a farmer. No, you're going to be a farmer. If your daddy's a carpenter, guess what? You're going to do the same. If your daddy's a doctor, guess what? You're not going to be an artist. And you will not even dare bring that out because it would have been seen as disrespectful, probably border the line of blasphemous. This isn't you. This isn't who you are. This is who you are. And if it was a bad reputation or a good reputation, you were born into it. And you can only hope to increase that reputation and become better. But you know what? If you were born into a bad name, so be it. That's what people expected of you. That's what people expected of you. And you knew that. But to say that God, right, holy is your name. We're saying name, something about God. They're talking about his character. They're talking about his essence. They're talking about his reputation. We're talking about how they see God, what they can expect of God. And so Jesus is Father of us. In heaven, the ideal. Your name, what we think of you, is holy. Man, this is loaded. Your identity, who you are, is holy. And this is a message, listen. This is a message that is preached throughout Hebrew Scripture. This idea of one's identity and reputation connected to one's name. You have, just really fast, Proverbs 22:1 says what? A good name, we know it, a good name is more desirable than great riches. A good name, your reputation, your character, to be esteemed, he says, is better than silver and gold. Ecclesiastes 7:1 says a good name is better than fine perfume. And how a house is run is directly connected to the owner of the house's character. And the owner of the house's character is directly connected to how the house is run. And so how the house is run matters. It actually matters. See, today you can run your house how you want. Nobody knows about it. Oh, but when they see your kids, you know they have a lot to say. I wonder what's going on up in there. Right? Yeah, see, some of you, it's okay to laugh because you know it's true. It's okay. It's okay. How a house is run matters. And it's directly connected to the identity of the person who is the author, originator, the owner. And so our Father, or Father of us in heaven, in the ideal, holy, though, he says, is your name. In other words, how you run things, yeah, we know it's for the best. We know it's good. We know it's we know that it's done with justice and righteousness. And as a result, there is peace. But here's the thing. Okay, here's the thing. You got to get this. You got to get this. See how I need a whiteboard, because if you could write all this out and you can make all, because it's all over the place. You can't just climb a ladder and get to the end here. Holy is your name. Oh, this is good. If you're sleeping, wake up. Here it is. By Jesus saying this, again, would have reached way back into their history and would have pulled out from their DNA some very important things that would have been laid out on the table. Would have reminded them, maybe been a refresher course to give them a new perspective of things. Holy is your name. That's just a phrase we use in songs, like 7-Eleven songs. We say, oh, you know, over and over again. This had meaning. It had meaning and purpose, and it was rich. It would have taken all the way back to Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. What we refer to as the Ten Commandments. You know what it says. You shall not take, I'm supposed to know what it says, but yes, I have to read it, right? You shall not take the Lord your God's name in vain. When we look at that, what do we think? Oh, you don't cuss, so don't use God's name while you're cussing, right? That's typically what we... No, that's not what it means. No, it's still probably a good idea not to do those things, but that's not what that means. Here's the interesting thing. The Hebrew word for don't take, literally means to lift something up and to carry it. So what do you think he's talking about? This would have reached all the way back to the purpose of the Torah, the covenant they had with God. The idea of taking God's... Think about it. The Torah is given to you. You're going to have a land. You're going to develop a nation. You're going to be doing all these things. There's a covenant that we have now together. There's a responsibility that you have. There's something that you're going to be doing in this world. And while you're doing it, this is how you conduct yourself. You know, you have the Ten Commandments, which are, like amendments and all kinds of stuff, and there's 7,000 of them. The point, and then there's the interpretations of what that really means, right? That'd be so confusing to me. But the point of this is, while you're doing this, you're doing it, you're carrying my name. And so, yeah, you carry my name properly in speech, sure. But it's so much more than that. It's how you conduct yourself in this world, and you go about doing the things that you have been called to do. You make sure that as you do it, what you're doing reflects who I am. It mirrors my image. And so what that tells us is that it is possible for mankind, for human being, to mirror the image of God, to reflect God's image. And they would have saw themselves as having that responsibility. That was the purpose of the law. That was the purpose of the covenant. That was a part of their responsibility and who they were. And according to the Torah, they were supposed to reflect this justice and this peace that we keep talking about. And the other thing is that saying your name is holy, they saw God as holy. But right under the surface, they saw their call as holy as well. That's the reason why they knew who God was in the first place. Check this out. In Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. The house of God. The household right here. Specific servants in the household of God. You're the servants in my house. And as servants, you're going to help me bring about the order that needs to be done on the earth. And all nations will know that I am God. That's in the mind of a Jew. And then verse 6. And you shall be to me, underline this, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Did you see it? Did you see it? You will be a kingdom of priests. A nation of priests in the world. And so the nation of Israel themselves, the picture is, they would be a priestly nation representing the priesthood among the nations. You see the bigger picture? It wasn't just about Israel, and it never was. You see the bigger picture? So the language that's used here is Israel serving a priestly role among the nations. And now, when Jesus says these words, and I don't know what the disciples were thinking. I don't even know what my wife's thinking. How am I going to? Sometimes I'm not even sure what I'm thinking. I don't know what they're thinking. However, these words would have been things that would have brought up images for them, laid out on the table, reaching back into history and the tradition. Our Father was enough to turn their heads. I wonder if some of them even listened to the rest of the prayer. They just probably got stuck on Our Father thing because that was just so foreign to them. But it tapped into who they were as a people, their history and their heritage. And so Jesus, we might say, says this, pray like this: to the Father of us, to the one who runs this house, to the one who's behind all these things, to the Creator, to the one who sustains it, to the one who runs this house. In heaven, we realize that things aren't the way that they should be as they are where you are. We acknowledge who you are. We acknowledge where we are. But we acknowledge also who we are right under the surface. Holy is your name. Holy. We acknowledge that the way you want things done, the way that you would do things, the way that things are your will, we acknowledge that it is for the best, and it is righteous, and it is just, and it brings about peace. But we also, right under the surface, realize our responsibility because we have been called, and that calling is holy. We acknowledge our responsibility in helping to unfold these things so that the world, we could be a kingdom of priests. Do you know the New Testament verse that talks about that you are a chosen generation, a priesthood? You are being built up as the house of God. You see the connections there? Now, the disciples aren't there yet. They're over here. Yeah, but we're there. And really, we should be beyond that. And understanding we have that same responsibility. We're in that covenant, as it were. There's something that binds us together. And the thing that binds us together is something that is meant to change the world and not just your church. And not just your house. The world. Now, as the prayer unfolds, it becomes so much more clear how they acknowledge this and what they're asking of God to help them do that very thing. And so, let's pray.